So we're going to shift gears a little bit here because I think we're going to start talking about this really interesting position that existed in Cyprus at this time to facilitate sort of communication between the Christian and Muslim communities, and that is the role of the Dragoman. I remember first coming across this very famous Cypriot Dragoman named Hadjigeorgakis Kornesios, who my typical tourist pamphlet that I would have as a kid in Cyprus simply said that he was a an interpreter, but I think we know that this is more than just an interpreter. In fact, I think you call him particularly enlightening, and this is a quote from one of your papers, particularly enlightening for understanding how a non-Muslim could rise to a position of prominence, end quote. So what do we know about him, just to start off? What do we know about this really interesting historical figure biographically?
He is one of the best documented instances of a single individual during the Ottoman period of Cypriot history. I actually don't think we know more about any other individual than about Hadjiorgakis. And this is because he had reached such a position of prominence and therefore left a lot of historical records behind him, showing the degree and extent of his activities. His case stands out because he is the only non Muslim in the Ottoman history of Cyprus, throughout the Ottoman history of Cyprus, who A was able to extend his authority over the Muslims, which is quite significant. I mean, non-Muslims are considered inferior and subject populations in an Islamic empire. Therefore, it would be a contradiction for an inferior subject to have authority over the ruling confessional group, that is the Muslims. And the second interesting detail rather, about Hadjigeorgakis is that he is the only Cypriot who was decapitated, executed in front of the Sublime Porte in Istanbul. No other Cypriot had had that kind of fate. And of course, the symbolic act of decapitating someone at the Sublime Porte as a means of making him an example to be avoided indicates the severity of what he was being accused of. So his activities were quite wide ranging. Yes, he is known as a dragoman, an interpreter, but if we only look at that particular title, I think that we will actually completely fail to understand the vastness of his economic activities. And he would be an excellent example of what historical literature describes as portfolio capitalists. That is, someone with a wide range of investments and activities in various aspects of the economy, who, in the case of Cyprus, managed to acquire a such a degree of power that can even be monopolistic. He was able to monopolize economic, social, and political power to the detriment of the island at large. And this is most probably the most important reason for having found the fate of being decapitated in front of the Sublime Gate.
Yeah, you actually write that he quote manipulated the market of a staple food, creating the very kinds of problems that such mechanisms were meant to prevent: death, famine, economic collapse. And this culminated in riots in 1802 for both the Greek and Turkish communities. One of the many times both Greek and Turkish communities rioted together to protest their economic situations. So, what exactly does that mean? I mean, what sort of crimes was he guilty of? And in a similar vein, I might have to remind you about the second question. These moments of insurrections within these Greek and Turkish communities, how often did they cross these ethnic boundaries? I mean, how often were they unified in their responses to increased taxation, famine, disease, that sort of stuff?
Well, this question, thank you for this question, because it gives me the opportunity to bring in another element, another crucial element here in explaining what is happening during the period and how was it possible for someone like Hadjigeorgakis to emerge. And this is the age of revolutions. The age of revolutions is a historical period, is a global historical process again, starting sometime in the 1760s or 50s even, all the way to the 1870s or 1840s, again, depending on the periodization. And it is a period that is characterized by revolutions not only in the form of the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Industrial Revolution, but other forms of instability, prolonged instability, tension, and turbulence. And increasingly, historians are looking at the local manifestations of these larger processes. So, Hadjigeorgakis is a product of this period. You mentioned earlier the joint revolts of Muslims and Christians. And I would say that in actual fact, the only Eastern instance of a revolt that we know of revolts that we know of, and we have enough historical evidence for to say that it was a joint intercommunal revolt. The first one is 1764. The second one is 1804. And the third one is 1833. And it is not by chance that these three revolts fall within the periodization of the age of revolutions. But it is not just these three revolts, and we have to distinguish between a revolt and a revolution. Let me be very clear. A revolution is something that overturns the existing order, programmatically or not. It is something that, for example, leads to a new independent state, that radically transforms the economy or society. In the case of revolts usually end up being a renegotiation of conditions and the perpetuation of the existing order, the existing authority and sovereignty. So in the case of Cyprus, we don't have that during this period, and it's very interesting that we don't. And in a way, it is an exception that is worth discussing. Perhaps we can go into that later in our discussion. To return to your question, what was it that united Christians and Muslims against Hadjigeorgakis? The Ottoman economy had particular characteristics, a particular character, which first and foremost ensured the provisioning of urban centers. This was a high priority for the Ottomans. The Ottomans were very clear about what, again, historians call moral economy. That is, an economy that is guided by certain moral principles. And these moral principles mean that there should be enough access to food. There should be some basic level of subsistence that people can survive by. And to a large extent, Hadjigeorgakis was able to provide the Ottoman state with a degree of stability and security. He was a reliable official at a time when Muslim officials were increasingly unreliable. And whenever they weren't, he would step in and fulfill their obligations, for example, dispatching the taxes that had been collected. When, for one reason or another, a Muslim official failed to do that, Hadjigeorgakis would step in and fulfill this task. So he presented himself and he made himself indispensable in the day-to-day running of the affairs of the province of Cyprus. This explains why he was such a powerful and long-lasting figure in the administration and politics of the island. As he was concentrating more and more power into his hands, and as he was eliminating any kind of opposition or balancing forces within society itself, this would eventually lead to this would eventually be detrimental to himself. And the example that you mentioned before, when he basically concentrated in 1802, he concentrated the cereals, all the cereals of Cyprus, using his official functions. He then exported them to Spain, where, in the context of the blockade that the English had enforced in Spain, this meant that these cereals would fetch a very high price, as highly commodities in high demand, and he was able to do that with the mediation of Maltese merchants. So we see the extent of his commercial networks, reaching all the way to the other end of the Mediterranean, and having sources of information that would tell him where his investments should be directed. He collected the whole of the cereals of the island. He managed to reap high profits out of this enterprise, but the result in Cyprus was famine. And this entailed the collapse of the moral economy and the sustainability of society on the island. So, from a bird's eye view, unfortunately, we don't have one single document that gives us a specific and clear reason why he was executed. But it was these kinds of activities which proved to be detrimental to local taxpayers that led to his downfall.
How does someone like Hadjigeorgakis rise to that position in the first place? Are they handpicked at a young age? Is it from a family of dragomans that it just passes down from son to son? How does this position fulfilled?
There is no one single path towards that position. Social privilege, of course, is one element that we can assume as being a necessary condition. I mean, someone like that would need to be literate, first and foremost. They would need to have a social circle and a network of political alliances that would support them in their career. Hadjigeorgakis himself was the son of a clothes merchant, a calico merchant from the village of Kritoutera in western Cyprus, in the mountains of Paphos, near Polis Chrysokou, for those familiar with the geography of Cyprus. And as a reasonably affluent merchant, we can assume that he was able to educate his son in Greek and in Ottoman. We also know that at an early age, Hadjigeorgakis was employed as the private interpreter of a Muslim notable in Cyprus, and in that context, he was accused of overtaxing various villages. We then know that he was married to the niece of the archbishop. So we can see how mingling in high social circles is again a prerequisite. And we also know that he had access to power networks in Istanbul itself, that he was close to at least some of the Fanariot families, that is, the powerful Christian Orthodox families living in the Fener region of Istanbul, which were imperial dragomans, imperial interpreters, and or administered the highly valuable provinces of Romania and Wallachia. So he had access to very powerful social circles in Istanbul. He had very strong patrons there. He engaged in various social struggles, and indeed, one hypothesis for the reason for his demise is that in the context of the shifting of balance of power in Istanbul, with the after the dethroning of Selim III, who we can assume that he was a patron of Hadjigeorgakis. When a new sultan came to power, Hadjigeorgakis was no longer in favor by powerful political circles.
Is conversion a prerequisite to hold that role, or did because when I see, for example, his portrait, and if anyone listening, please do Google it. It's a pretty famous portrait of Hadjigeorgakis. He looks thoroughly Ottoman. One could assume that he might even be might have converted as well. Was that a prerequisite for the period and for that position?
Not at all. Not at all. It's exactly, this is a very good example of what I said before about how the Ottomans were flexible and pragmatic enough to accommodate for local and regional differences in administering their very, very diverse provinces.
Okay.
Conversion was certainly not a prerequisite, but having a cultural outlook, and this relates to the point that you're making about his portrait, having a cultural outlook and aesthetic choices which reflect those of the dominant religious and social group in the Ottoman Empire is certainly something that is at play here. And that is why one may look at Hadjigeorgakis and, not knowing anything about him, how they may think or consider that they are actually a Muslim. This is why someone may reach that conclusion.
What happened to his property after his execution, and presumably the debts that he had incurred in his machinations, for a lack of a better word? Who ended up having to pay for all this, all of his economic endeavors, for lack, if we can say that.
um, well, this was a highly controversial issue. As soon as he was executed, the standard procedure for confiscating the property of of an out of favor official was initiated, and as was usually the case in these instances, the value of the properties that were found and evaluated was highly below expectations, was very low. So other means had to be employed in order to acquire the assets of the Dragoman. And during after the what we didn't say before is that after the 1804 revolt, Hadjigeorgakis fled, escaped to Istanbul, and stayed there until 1808 when he was executed. And while in Istanbul, he accumulated a high amount of debts from mainly Armenian financiers, and he was able to accrue these debts by stating that these loans are for official business, acting on behalf of the people of Cyprus, both Muslims and non-Muslims. That was essentially the security that he offered to his borrowers. And when he was executed, these lenders demanded what was due to them according to these bonds, and this amount of money was being asked by Cypriots themselves, and it was a very high amount of money, 1.5 million kurush. That was the Ottoman currency, and to give you an idea of the scale of this amount, the whole property of Hadjigeorgakis was evaluated at 500,000 kurush, and of course this was an undervalued amount of money. And all this, again, this is not his whole property or all of his assets. These are just loans that he had accrued over that period of time, for which eventually Cypriots were responsible. It became a long drawn and controversial affair. Eventually, the Cypriots were excused of these loans and they were written off. But until then, it was a rather traumatic and difficult chapter in Cypriot history.
And it wouldn't be too much longer before another seismic event happens in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is the Greek uprising in 1821. How would this affect the people of Cyprus? What comes to mind is some really famous or infamous executions in this period. How else did this affect Cyprus in this time?
1821 is a very interesting and again misunderstood example or question in Cypriot history. First of all, we have this infamous case of execution of various notables for conspiring against the Ottoman state. Greek sources inflate the numbers of those executed to I think to several hundreds, whereas Ottoman sources indicate a much much lower figure of around 70, if I'm not mistaken, of those who were proscribed to be executed, some of which escaped and went either to Greece or to Egypt. Of course, this is a very significant event because those executed were at the top of the social hierarchies. They were merchants, they were traders, and they were highly influential people in the local economy. So the execution of this group certainly had an important impact at a local level, much more so because it entailed the transfer of power and wealth from the hands of the people executed to other Muslims who had taken over this wealth and power. It also, of course, inaugurated a period of terror for the Christians of the island, which essentially meant, and this was a preventive, so to speak, strike on behalf of the local Ottoman authorities, which ensured that Christians would not dare engage in any kind of revolutionary activity on the island. And indeed, this is something that is often is not being adequately discussed. There is no revolutionary activity in Cyprus apart from the preparations for which, on account of which, the executions took place. But after that, there is no uprising in Cyprus during the Greek revolution, just some minor events of the Greek revolutionary navy engaging in some raiding activity, but that's just about it. So another interesting element would be good to consider here is that the quintessential event of the Ottoman age of revolutions, that is the Greek Revolution, actually is not strongly reflected in Cyprus. There is no revolutionary activity in Cyprus after 1821. We should, of course, acknowledge and point out that quite a few Cypriots went to revolutionary Greece to fight. But this is a different story. We're talking about revolutionary activity in Cyprus itself. Now, there is a reshuffling of the church. Strictly speaking, you do not have a weakening of the church in terms of the jurisdiction or authority that it had. But there were limits to what the Ottoman governor Küçük, the infamous Küçük Mehmet, had demanded. For example, he demanded the demolition of Kikos Monastery, which was the single biggest economic establishment in Cyprus at the time. In the 1832-33 property census, the single biggest property holder of the island is the Kikos Monastery. And the governor wanted to demolish the monastery and confiscate all its property. You can imagine the scale of a redistribution of wealth that this would entail. And Ottoman documents indicate that permission was not given for such an act on behalf of Istanbul. So he was not able to and if we can say that there was one primary motivation for Küçük Mehmed, was this redistribution of wealth. And in this instance of the Kikos monastery, he did not achieve that. So, yes, the church would now have to operate under a more restrictive framework and under the fear of Muslim reprisals and tensions between Muslims and Christians. But this does not necessitate a weakening of its administrative position. And indeed, the role of the church in the years and decades to come is quite pronounced. Now, what is interesting about 1821 and the redistribution of wealth and power that took place during this period is the emergence of new social groups which questioned the authority of the church and had an alternative political vision that was much more clearly attached to Greek nationalism and questioned the traditional authority of the church. This was a group of a new social group of merchants who in the decades after 1821 were able to consolidate their social, economic, and political position and demanded and acquired a higher say in political affairs. So again, this is another example of internal tensions within the community and the social cleavages that existed within a confessional group.
Do we have any evidence of tensions that are manifested in this period amongst Greek and or Christian and Muslim communities? I mean, we've been talking about the hierarchical structures and what ended up happening to some people in authority. But does this manifest itself on the ground?
The first instance, we do. The short answer is we do. The first instance where we have what we would call today as discourses of religious tensions, confessionally inspired violence. Let's say the first instance where we have, and I want to emphasize this for the whole of the Ottoman period of Cyprus, the first instance where we have Muslims targeting Christians en masse is in 1802 and the affair of the famine that Hadjigeorgakis caused. And this is something that not only outraged Muslims, but it had also outraged the Archbishop, who, again, let me remind you, was the uncle of his wife. So it is the intensification of social and economic processes and the creation of new social groups with a new cultural and intellectual outlook, which challenged the established order of things. What was the established order of things? The submission of the non-Muslims to the authority of Islam, the acknowledgement of the superiority of Islam by non-Muslims. All these issues are starting to the overturning of the established order and questioning the established order was something that started that it was first manifested in historical sources in 1802. And from then on, gradually, we have more and more instances of interconfessional tension and conflict, which culminates. And for me, this is the beginning. The early 19th century is the beginning of the history of the Cyprus problem and ethno religious conflict in Cyprus. This is what leads to the conflict of the 20th century. We cannot understand the conflict of the 20th century if we don't grasp the social and economic foundations and the historical context that took place in the 19th century.
All of this is incredibly fascinating. I mean, we could talk we could talk about this endlessly. But Antonis, I also want to honor your time and your peninsular island, Cyprus in the Mediterranean, Ottoman Age of revolutions. When exactly is that going to be released for those who are interested?
We are at the final stages of application right now. We're finalizing the proofs, and this is going to take place. This is going to finish probably this week, which means it goes off to the printers. So, in all probability, by the end of the month, it will be out and circulating.
And does this mean the beginning or possibly the end of a sabbatical, or what's next on the agenda?
A sabbatical, I'm not so sure, but there's quite a few things on the agenda. One of them is finalizing another book project on the first Turkish history of the Greek Revolution, which was published in 1944, which is quite a long way after the foundation of the Turkish Republic. And this is a book that will translate and publish this particular work, but also discuss the importance of this particular book, situated in its intellectual context of the interwar and war years, Second World War years, and show a very different understanding of the Greek Revolution to the one that people in Turkey may have today. And also showing how historical interpretations of the Greek Revolution in Turkey have not always been the same, but they have changed and shifted over time. So that's the next project, and then once that is done, my what I have in mind is an environmental history of Cyprus, where I will be able to situate to put questions of environmental history at center stage and see what this can tell us about the past, present, but most importantly, the future of Cyprus.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. I actually meant to ask you, apart from Greek and English, are you fluent in Turkish?
Yes, yes.
And does that also mean you are fluent in Ottoman? Some of the sources that you're reading, presumably, would be quite different from the modern Turkish that we would speak in here today.
Indeed, yes. Well, Ottoman Turkish is, of course, a dead language. It's no longer spoken today, but most of the sources actually that I've used are in Ottoman, and this is, I think, the novelty of that the new knowledge that this documentation can bring. The Ottoman history of Cyprus has been written predominantly on the basis of Greek or European sources, even by Ottoman historians. And it's very, very important to bring in the Ottoman perspective, not to just show a different point of view, because different points of view are not necessarily equal or valuable, but for what these sources can tell us beyond the intentions of their authors. And this is why Ottoman documentation is so important in my view. And it fills in a lot of the gaps that we have from the history of Cyprus, but most importantly, it confirms to the iota things that we already know from other sources. So we know that some of the previous knowledge is valid, and we can fill in a lot of the gaps with Ottoman documentation.
Again, thank you so much, Antonis, for being a guest on the show.
Well, I mean, it's been a real pleasure to be on the show, and really, I want to thank you as well for giving me the opportunity to have this very fascinating discussion and discuss these issues with you and share my thoughts with your audience. And again,
Take care. Have a great evening.
you too. You too.
Okay.
Bye,
Bye
Andre.
now.